Everyone agrees that UK infrastructure is in pretty poor shape. Everyone agrees that major upgrades are required. There's no real doubt or deviation from that view. And it's always been the view for the last, 20 years plus. And we've tried to do it before. We tried back with the National Infrastructure Plan, the first one, back in 2011. We were going to build, build, build. We were going to put right decades of underinvestment. But nothing really happened, and nothing is happening. The 1.5 million houses, well, we'll be lucky to build half of them. House building is going to be about the same as it's always been. And if we look at the state of the sewers, if we look at the state of the water systems, if we look at the state of our energy networks, if we look at the state of our transport systems, it's pretty clear to most people that nothing much is going on to make a great deal of difference. People expect us to muddle through, patch and mend, sticky plasters. And that begs the question, why? Why is it that we can't move away from the sticky plasters and actually do something constructive and do this once in a generation, actually probably once in 2 generations, refab and refitting of so much of what we need for the future economy going forward? Why do we have to carry on putting up with all the potholes? The reasons are not superficial. They're very, very deep. And there are basically at least 4 of them. It's incredibly expensive to build infrastructure in Britain. That's the first one. It costs 16 billion per gigawatt of nuclear power. It costs, 40 billion plus for a runway and associated terminals at Heathrow. It costs $1 billion a mile to build HS2. And so it goes on and on and on. We can't build lots of infrastructure at a cost that's affordable and have amongst the highest energy costs in the developed world. Governments deliberately and continuously increasing the cost of labour, and through the doubts about the fiscal position and the government's borrowing and debt, having very, very high interest rates and therefore having to pay a lot on the debt as part of public expenditure and having a higher cost of capital. Higher energy costs, higher labour costs and higher costs of capital are not the route to providing the framework within which infrastructure can be built at scale, at speed, to the degree that this country needs it. Behind that lies the money question, and that's our second constraint. The British love living beyond their means. They like living beyond their environmental means, and they like living beyond their infrastructure needs. We don't save very much in this country. We don't have a set aside for the sorts of monies that would be needed to fund and finance infrastructure on the scale we need. Savings is pretty close to zero, net of capital depreciation. We can't even keep up with providing the monies to maintain what we've got, let alone set aside the sorts of numbers that countries which are really good at infrastructure, of course China stands out, from our income. We don't save 30% of income. We don't save 50%. We don't save very much at all. And therefore, we are beholden to the kindness of strangers. Investment in infrastructure in this country is almost entirely foreign investment and foreign money. That's the second problem. The third one is the government itself has no money. Historically, governments were always part and parcel of infrastructure spend. Governments paid for social housing. Governments supported investment in roads, in railways, and indeed across water as well. They don't now because there is no money. That's why it was privatised. That's why we handed over the industries to the private sector, because we didn't want to pay. We didn't want to pay as we go, and government didn't want to divert taxpayers' money into longer term infrastructure spend. So that's a further problem. There is no savings, and that leads to the problem of governments having no money. If we look at the current state of the government's financial position, we have nearly 3 trillion of debt. Interest payments on past debt are pretty close to about 100 billion per annum, and the third largest item of public expenditure. Contrary to everything the government says, we are not balancing the books on our current spending. We're on a deficit about 4 to 5% of GDP. And why? Well, it's not entirely the government's fault or its predecessors. We, the voters, do not want to vote for the sorts of public expenditure constraints that would be necessary to live beyond our means. We spend, and it's the dominant bit of public expenditure, an incredible amount on welfare. And in a democracy, in a civilized society, we should spend on welfare. But I've never understood how we can spend much more than 300 billion per annum and still have poor people. Why do we need so much money to be spent on welfare to alleviate poverty? And the answer is, it's incredibly inefficient. But we prefer that. Labour MPs prefer extending child benefit beyond 2 children, rather than the question of budgets for potholes or railways or other bits of core infrastructure. No savings, government has no money, and then whenever shocks hit, and we have to remember this is the decade of the shocks, we've had COVID, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've had Trump's April tariffs, and now we have Iran. Whenever shocks hit, what does government do? Well, because it has no money to spare, because there aren't much by way of savings to draw upon, what it does is it resorts to cutting capital expenditure to prop up current spending. And that's what's going on at the moment. The fiscal rules, to the extent they are serious fiscal rules, and they are pretty lax, still bind, and they make the government take decisions which can't possibly be sensible in the framework of what we need to do in this country. Thames Water is a kind of case study par excellence of what we get wrong. This is a company that's been floundering around for more than 2 years, discussing with the regulator whether the regulator will accept Ofwat, will accept a creditor arrangement for the company, as opposed to put the company into special administration, where it should have gone long ago. Instead of cracking down and saying, look, enough's enough, this company needs to be rebased, it needs new owners, the creditors, whatever their merit and expertise, are not the natural owners of a water company. The debt position is unsustainable. Get on with it, put it in special administration, get new owners in, and get on with the turnaround plan, which so far seems to be going not that far. Indeed, we're still waiting for the new management, which might emerge after and if the regulator agrees to what the creditors are demanding. That's a case of short-termism. The Treasury is scared that it might cost them a bit over the special administration, though the period in which it's in administration, though in the end it won't cost them a penny, or it shouldn't. And the government is also fearful of its backbenchers that if it went into administration, they would want the state to step in more generally and just nationalise it. Well, if that's what our politics dictate, you can see the real effects in just looking at the state of the River Thames and its tributaries and the mess that Thames Water's in. That's the price that we pay for not addressing the fundamentals which lie behind what would have to be done if we wanted to seriously address our infrastructure. We would have to, and the list is really demanding, we would have to get the energy cost down in this country. That means changing policy and moving away from policies which had produced the highest energy costs or electricity costs for the industrial sector and hugely influenced construction costs. We would have to undo things like national insurance increases on employers. We'd have to address the minimum wage. We'd have to address the workers' rights. And we would have to address the debt, because we'd have to address why our interest rates are higher than virtually any other developed country, and why we have to pay a premium of at least 1% plus on the cost of our debt vis-a-vis the Eurozone. We'd have to address those questions. And the answer to that question is you can't go on in a world in which your debt is at the current level and you prioritise welfare and social spending over and above doing something to get economic growth up. Debt would not be so serious in this country if there was economic growth. But we don't have economic growth because of the way the debt bears upon the economy and all those other costs. We'd have to incentivize people to save. That means thinking hard about whether you really want to tax capital in the way that this government does. You can't, on the one hand, increase capital gains tax, increase inheritance tax, and mess about with the incentives for pensions. You can't do that on the one hand for distributional reasons and expect that savings will go up as a result. No, it will go down. The incentives to save in this country are significantly lower now than they were a couple of years ago. And even then, they weren't great. So you need to do that. And you need to have a system which says that there should not be an inbuilt bias towards operating costs, social spending and so on, against capital budgets that chop and change the infrastructure projects in order to bail out short-term costs. And where there are significant investments to be made, like in defence, you can't pay for defence by cutting capital projects elsewhere. The real choice, if one wants to expand the defence framework, is to cut public expenditure on current costs, like welfare, etc., improve its efficiency in order to make room for that investment. Now, I think it's pretty clear, confronted with $500 billion, maybe $750 billion of capex projects out there, that there is no genuine appetite amongst most politicians and behind that the electorate to do what would be necessary to make the transformation within which this infrastructure would happen. Those high costs are also political choices as well as choices that confront investors and those trying to fund and finance infrastructure project going on. We don't want to do what China would do, for example, on the infrastructure front. We like it as it is. And that leads to the rather unpleasant and unfortunate conclusion that roll forward another 10 years or 15 years, and the same problems that confronted us in 2011 with the first infrastructure problem will still be up there and still serious constraints on the British economy. The trouble is that the underlying infrastructure is not in steady state. It's potentially declining quite fast as the economy around it changes. It's probably likely that we won't solve our problems on infrastructure now, just as we didn't back in 2011. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. This is a set of problems that can be solved. Those constraints, those 4 areas of problems, are all solvable problems. But it does mean ultimately something fairly fundamental. We do have to try to live within our infrastructure means rather than do what we like doing, which is living beyond them and borrowing so the next generation inherits those assets. That's the sad reality, and it calls for a really substantial economy-wide set of changes if we are to address the infrastructure, which we should. Thank you.